The alien empire demanded surrender, total submission, no negotiation, no mercy. An entire civilization was expected to bow its head, lower its flag, and accept its place beneath a power that believed dominance was destiny. The message was simple and brutal: resist and be erased, submit and be allowed to exist under their rule. That was the choice presented to humanity, and humanity answered with one soldier, not an army, not a massive fleet ready for war, not a desperate swarm of ships, trying to prove courage through numbers, just one human being, one individual standing as the response to an empire that believed intimidation alone could break an entire species. Pause for a moment and really think about what that means. An empire that controlled worlds expected surrender. They believed fear was enough. They believed the sheer weight of their power would crush the spirit of resistance before it even had a chance to rise. In their minds, the outcome was already decided. Empires think like that. Power convinces them the future belongs only to those who already dominate the present. But something happened that they did not calculate. Humanity did not respond with panic. Humanity did not respond with pleading messages or desperate negotiations. Instead, the answer came in the most unexpected form possible: one soldier. That single decision carried a message louder than 1,000 warships. It said something simple, something dangerous, something every empire in history has always failed to understand. Power does not automatically create obedience, and that truth is uncomfortable, not just for empires, but for anyone who has spent their life believing strength is measured only by numbers, bigger armies, bigger weapons, bigger systems of control. That is the illusion of dominance most civilizations eventually fall into. But history, whether written in blood on ancient battlefields or in the silent cold of distant galaxies, repeats the same lesson again and again. One determined mind can disrupt an entire system. The empire believed surrender was the logical response. From their perspective, resistance made no sense. The difference in power was overwhelming. They had fleets large enough to blot out stars, weapons capable of erasing continents, a reputation built across countless worlds where opposition had already been crushed. So they expected the same outcome again. Fear would spread. Leaders would panic. Populations would beg for survival. Someone would eventually speak the words every empire loves to hear: "We surrender." But the response they received carried none of that desperation. Just one soldier. That answer forced a question the empire never expected to ask. Why? Why would a species facing overwhelming power respond with something so small, so simple, so seemingly insignificant? Because the response was never about size, it was about defiance. And defiance is the one force every empire eventually struggles to control. Fear can dominate the weak. Fear can silence the uncertain. Fear can force obedience from those who believe survival is worth more than freedom. But fear collapses the moment someone decides it doesn't work anymore. That is the moment power begins to shift. One soldier represented that shift, not because of weapons, not because of strategy, but because the very act of standing there refused to accept the rules the empire believed were absolute. Empires rely on one critical assumption: that resistance will always collapse under pressure, that individuals will eventually calculate the odds and choose submission, that survival instincts will always overpower courage. But human history has never followed that script. Again and again, individuals have stood in impossible situations and made a decision that defies logic, statistics, and every prediction built on fear. The decision to refuse surrender. That kind of decision terrifies powerful systems because it spreads. One act of defiance forces others to ask a dangerous question: what if power is not as absolute as it looks? And that is where the true story begins. Because when humanity sent one soldier, it was not sending a weapon. It was sending a message. A message that said the empire had misunderstood something fundamental about the species it had just threatened. They thought they were facing a civilization, What they were actually facing was the human will. From the beginning, the Empire believed the outcome was already decided. Their fleets stretched across star systems. Their weapons could reduce planets to silence. Entire civilizations had already fallen under the weight of their authority. To them, power was a simple equation. The side with the greatest force wins, and everyone else eventually accepts their place beneath it. That belief had worked before. World after world had surrendered the moment the Empire appeared on the horizon of their skies. Leaders calculated the odds and chose survival over resistance. Populations bowed their heads because the alternative seemed impossible. Fear did the work long before any battle ever needed to begin. The Empire trusted that pattern. It had become the foundation of their dominance. But there is a dangerous flaw in that kind of thinking. Numbers create confidence, but they also create blindness. When power grows large enough, it stops questioning itself. It stops imagining that something smaller could ever threaten it. Strength becomes routine. Victory becomes expected. And eventually, the idea of failure disappears from the mind entirely. That is the moment power becomes fragile. The Empire believed humanity would follow the same path as every civilization before it. They assumed fear would spread quickly, that leaders would panic, that surrender would be announced in the name of preservation. They believed the difference in strength was so overwhelming that resistance would never even be considered. From their perspective, it was logical. Why fight a battle that cannot be won? Why sacrifice everything when survival can be purchased with obedience? Those questions sound reasonable. In fact, they sound like the kind of advice people give every day. When facing overwhelming odds, choose safety, protect what remains, accept reality. But those ideas hide a truth most people rarely admit. Once surrender becomes the default response to power, freedom disappears long before the fight even begins. The Empire had seen this happen repeatedly. Civilizations surrendered, their independence step by step. First they gave up their defenses, then their decisions, then their identity. Eventually, entire species lived under control so complete they no longer remembered what independence had felt like. And every time it happened, the Empire believed it proved something. They believed it proved that power always wins. But history, both human and otherwise, carries a different lesson. Power only wins when resistance disappears. The Empire misunderstood humanity because they assumed humans would think like every other species they had conquered. They believed fear would silence them. They believed logic would convince them resistance was pointless. What they failed to understand was that humans have never been a species built purely on logic. Human beings have repeatedly chosen the harder path when something important was at stake. Again and again, people have stood in situations where defeat seemed guaranteed and still refused to step aside. Not because the odds were good, but because surrender felt worse than loss. This is the part powerful empires never fully understand. They see strength as a matter of weapons and fleets. They measure dominance through territory and technology. They believe control comes from the ability to destroy anything that challenges them. But destruction does not automatically create obedience. A population can be threatened into silence, but silence does not mean acceptance. Beneath the surface, resistance waits. It waits for the moment when someone finally decides the fear no longer matters. And when that moment arrives, the balance of power begins to change. The Empire believed their numbers guaranteed victory. They believed their reputation would force surrender before conflict even started. They believed humanity would behave like every other civilization that had faced overwhelming power. That assumption became their greatest weakness, because numbers only intimidate those who already believe they are powerless. The moment someone stops believing that, the entire structure of fear begins to crack. Humanity did not respond with the massive force the Empire expected. There was no attempt to match the size of their fleets, no desperate show of strength designed to compete with their weapons. Instead, the response was something far more unsettling. Humanity sent one soldier. To the Empire, it looked insignificant. To anyone paying attention, it revealed something terrifying. Humanity had never accepted the equation that power alone decides the outcome. One mind can change the direction of everything. That truth has repeated itself across centuries, across civilizations, across moments where the future looked fixed and unchangeable. Empires rise, believing they control destiny. Systems expand, believing they are permanent. Power builds walls around itself and begins to assume nothing outside those walls can threaten it. Yet again and again the structure cracks not because of overwhelming force but because one person refuses to accept the rules everyone else quietly agreed to follow. That is the power hidden inside a single mind that decides it will not bend. Most people never realize this because they spend their lives believing influence comes from permission. They assume change requires massive support, massive numbers, massive resources. They wait for the crowd to move first. They wait for approval before daring to stand apart. But the crowd rarely moves without someone stepping forward alone. Every major shift in history began that way. One person asking a question others were too afraid to ask. One person refusing to follow an order everyone else obeyed without thinking. One person deciding that fear would not dictate their choices anymore. The empire never calculated that possibility. They saw humanity as a collective, a population, a civilization made of billions of individuals who would eventually respond like any other species faced with overwhelming force. They expected negotiations, protests, hesitation, debate. They expected leaders calculating risk and reward. What they did not expect was a single individual representing something far larger than themselves. Because the moment one mind refuses submission, it forces everyone watching to reconsider what they thought was inevitable. Fear operates on a simple principle. It convinces people that resistance is pointless. It tells them they are alone. It isolates them with the belief that everyone else has already accepted defeat. Under that illusion, surrender spreads quietly and efficiently, but the illusion collapses. The moment someone stands up and proves it wrong, one person standing without fear becomes a signal, a reminder that surrender was never the only option. Suddenly the narrative shifts. Suddenly the idea of resistance becomes real again. This is what empires truly fear. Not armies. Not weapons. They fear the moment individuals stop believing in the inevitability of their power, because once that belief disappears, control begins to weaken. Systems built on intimidation start losing their foundation. The strength that once looked absolute begins to look fragile. The empire believed strength came from the size of their fleets and the reach of their weapons. They believed dominance meant nobody would ever dare challenge them. But those assumptions rely on one condition, that everyone accepts the rules set by power. Humanity has a long history of breaking those rules. Throughout time, people have faced situations where logic demanded surrender, where survival seemed possible only through obedience, where resistance promised nothing but destruction. Yet again and again, individuals stepped forward and chose something different. They chose defiance, not because they were guaranteed victory, but because surrender meant losing something deeper than life itself. Dignity, freedom, identity. Those values are difficult for empires to understand because they cannot be measured the way weapons and fleets can. They cannot be calculated on tactical maps or predicted through military strategy. They live entirely inside the human mind, and when that mind reaches a certain point, fear loses its authority. The empire underestimated this because they assumed individuals were insignificant compared to the machinery of power. They believed a single person could never disrupt something as vast as their rule, but they ignored a simple truth that has undone powerful systems throughout history. Large structures move slowly. They depend on predictability. They rely on the assumption that everyone will behave in ways that maintain the system. One unpredictable mind can disrupt that balance. One individual refusing obedience introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads faster than fear. When one person demonstrates that resistance is possible, others begin questioning the limits that once seemed absolute. This is why the decision to send one soldier carried meaning far beyond the individual standing there. It represented a mindset, a refusal to accept that power automatically decides the outcome. The Empire saw one person. What they were actually facing was something far more dangerous. A species capable of producing minds that refuse to surrender. The Empire believed surrender was the only rational outcome. From their perspective, the equation was simple. Their fleets were larger, their weapons were stronger, their control over entire star systems proved that resistance against them had always ended the same way. When power reaches that scale, it begins to see its dominance as something permanent, something unquestionable. Over time, the belief grows stronger with every victory. Eventually it turns into certainty, certainty that no one would challenge them. Certainty that fear would silence opposition before it ever became dangerous. Certainty that the mere presence of their power would force obedience without the need for conflict. That certainty became their greatest mistake. History has shown the same pattern countless times. Powerful systems grow so confident in their strength that they stop imagining the possibility of defiance. They assume everyone facing them will behave logically, cautiously, predictably. They expect others to calculate the odds and choose survival over resistance. That expectation works most of the time. Fear has a powerful influence over decision-making. When individuals or civilizations face overwhelming force, survival instincts begin to dominate their thinking. Leaders start searching for compromise. Populations begin hoping the threat will pass if they remain quiet long enough. Gradually, resistance dissolves into acceptance. Empires rely on this process. They do not need to destroy every opponent if most of them surrender before the fight begins. Fear becomes more efficient than war. Intimidation becomes the primary weapon. When the threat alone produces obedience, the empire grows stronger without even needing to act. That was the strategy behind the demand for surrender. The empire believed the outcome was already written. Humanity would evaluate the situation, recognize the impossible odds, and choose the only logical path available. Submission would come quietly. Resistance would never take shape. But logic has limits when it confronts human stubbornness. Humans have repeatedly demonstrated a strange habit of rejecting the logical choice when it demands surrender. Again and again, individuals have faced overwhelming odds and still refused to step aside. Not because victory was guaranteed, not because success seemed likely, but because something inside them refused to accept the idea that power alone should determine the future. This refusal confuses powerful systems. It appears irrational. It breaks the calculations that leaders rely on when they plan their dominance. When someone refuses to follow predictable patterns, the entire structure of control begins to weaken. The empire expected humanity to behave like every other civilization they had conquered. They assumed fear would spread quickly, convincing leaders to protect their populations through surrender. They expected debate, hesitation, and eventually acceptance. Instead, they encountered defiance. Not loud, chaotic rebellion, not a desperate attempt to match their power with force. Something quieter, but far more unsettling. A simple refusal to kneel. Defiance operates differently than fear. Fear compresses people into silence. Defiance expands their thinking. Once someone realizes submission is not the only option, the entire mental landscape changes. The impossible suddenly becomes worth attempting. This is why defiance spreads so quickly once it appears. One act forces others to reconsider their assumptions. If one person can refuse, maybe others can as well. If resistance exists at all, then surrender was never truly inevitable. Empires recognize this danger, even if they do not always understand it. That is why they try to crush defiance immediately. They cannot allow the idea to grow. They cannot risk individuals discovering that power does not automatically guarantee obedience. Because the moment that realization spreads, the empire loses its most important weapon, control over belief. The empire believed humanity would calculate the odds and give up. They assumed logic would push people toward safety. They assumed survival instincts would overpower pride, courage, and stubbornness. But those assumptions ignored one defining trait of the species they had just threatened. Humans do not always choose the safest path. Sometimes they choose the path that preserves something deeper than survival. The empire demanded surrender because they believed fear would end the conflict before it began. Instead, their demand revealed something they had never fully understood. Humanity was never afraid of impossible odds. Humanity was afraid of becoming a species that accepted them. Courage is one of the most misunderstood forces in existence. People imagine it as something loud and dramatic, something that appears only in moments of great crisis, something reserved for heroes whose names eventually fill the pages of history. But real courage rarely looks like that. It does not announce itself with speeches or spectacle. It appears quietly, often in moments when the easier path would be to stay silent and accept whatever pressure is being applied. That quiet moment is where the true battle happens. Most people believe courage means acting without fear. That idea sounds impressive, but it is also completely false. Fear is almost always present. Fear is natural. It warns about danger, about loss, about consequences that could change everything. The difference between courage and surrender is not the absence of fear. The difference is the decision that fear will not make the final choice. That decision is far rarer than most people realize. Across countless situations, individuals face pressure that pushes them toward submission. The pressure might come from authority, from social expectations, from systems that reward obedience and punish resistance. Over time, people learn that compliance keeps life predictable. Compliance avoids conflict. Compliance protects comfort, and gradually, that habit becomes normal. People begin convincing themselves that surrender is simply the practical option. They tell themselves resistance would not matter anyway. They repeat the same reasoning that powerful systems depend on, that the risk of standing up is greater than the value of doing so. This is how courage slowly disappears, not through force, but through quiet acceptance of the idea that resistance is pointless. The empire believed humanity would follow this exact pattern. They assumed the demand for surrender would trigger fear strong enough to silence any possibility of defiance. Leaders would hesitate. Populations would question whether survival required compromise. Eventually, the conclusion would appear obvious. Accept the terms. Stay alive. From the empire's perspective, that outcome represented rational behavior. Every civilization they had conquered had eventually reached the same decision. Fear guided them toward surrender because survival seemed more valuable than pride. But courage disrupts that calculation. Courage introduces a different question into the situation. Instead of asking what is safest, it asks what is worth protecting, even if safety disappears. That shift changes everything. Suddenly, the discussion is no longer about survival alone. It becomes about identity, dignity, and the refusal to live under control. That kind of thinking is difficult to predict because it does not follow simple logic. It follows conviction. Conviction can appear suddenly inside a single mind. Sometimes, it grows slowly over years of frustration and quiet resistance. Sometimes it arrives in a single moment when someone realizes they cannot accept the path being forced upon them. Once that moment happens, the balance between fear and courage begins to shift. Fear still exists. The risks are still real. The consequences may even be catastrophic. But the decision changes. Instead of surrendering to avoid loss, the individual accepts the possibility of loss in order to preserve something deeper. This is why courage has always been so dangerous to powerful systems. A system built on intimidation relies on people believing resistance will cost too much. It depends on the assumption that fear will always outweigh conviction. As long as that assumption holds true, control remains stable. But the moment someone proves that conviction can overpower fear, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. Others begin to question their own limits. They begin to realize that the boundaries placed around them may not be as absolute as they once believed. Courage spreads in subtle ways, not through commands or orders, but through the simple example of someone refusing to bow. The empire did not expect this kind of response from humanity. They assumed logic would guide every decision. They assumed survival instincts would erase any impulse toward resistance. What they encountered instead was something far more difficult to control. Species capable of producing individuals who decide that surrender is not acceptable, even when the alternative looks impossible. That is the true nature of courage, not dramatic heroism. Just a quiet decision repeated again and again. A decision that says fear may exist, consequences may follow, and the odds may be overwhelming. But surrender will not be the answer. Powerful empires often believe their dominance is permanent. They build fleets large enough to intimidate entire civilizations. They create weapons capable of erasing worlds. They expand their reach across systems until the idea of opposition begins to look absurd. With every victory, their confidence grows stronger. With every surrender they receive, their belief in their own invincibility becomes deeper. Eventually, that belief hardens into certainty. The empire had reached that point long ago. Their history was filled with examples of resistance crushed and civilizations absorbed into their control. They had seen countless species attempt to challenge them, and each time the result followed the same pattern. The stronger force prevailed, the weaker force disappeared. From their perspective, the lesson was clear. Strength decides everything. But that conclusion ignored a crucial detail that powerful systems often overlook. Strength does not only exist in weapons and fleets. Strength also exists in mindset. The empire understood how to build machines of war. They understood how to deploy overwhelming force. They understood how to dominate through intimidation and destruction. But they never fully understood the unpredictable nature of human persistence. Humanity's history has always been shaped by the ability to recover after defeat. Loss has never been the end of the story. Civilizations have fallen, cities have burned, and generations have faced overwhelming obstacles. Yet again and again, people found ways to rebuild, adapt, and continue forward. This pattern has defined the species for as long as memory exists. Failure does not automatically end human ambition. Destruction does not erase human determination. When pressure increases, many individuals begin searching for ways to resist rather than ways to surrender. This mindset is difficult for powerful empires to calculate because it refuses to follow predictable rules. A civilization that always chooses safety can be controlled. A population that prioritizes survival above all else can be managed through fear. But a species that continues standing up after repeated losses becomes far more complicated. The empire expected humanity to behave logically according to their own understanding of power. They believed the sight of their fleets alone would force immediate submission. They assumed the difference in strength would convince humans that resistance served no purpose. What they failed to realize was that humans have never relied purely on favorable odds before deciding whether to act. Across history, individuals and societies have faced opponents stronger than themselves and still refused to disappear. Sometimes they lost battles. Sometimes entire generations endured suffering because of those choices. But surrender was never guaranteed simply because the enemy looked stronger. Human stubbornness does not always follow rational calculations. Instead of measuring only the likelihood of victory, humans often measure whether giving up would destroy something more valuable than survival. Freedom, dignity, and independence carry weight that cannot be easily quantified. When those values feel threatened, something inside the human mind begins to shift. Suddenly, the situation is no longer about avoiding defeat. It becomes about refusing submission. This mindset explains why powerful systems throughout history eventually encounter resistance they cannot fully eliminate. Even when victories appear complete, the possibility of rebellion remains. Even after defeat, new individuals appear who refuse to accept the outcome as final. The empire underestimated this trait completely. They believed humanity would behave like the civilizations they had already conquered. They assumed the threat of destruction would break human will before resistance could take shape. They trusted that intimidation alone would produce obedience. But intimidation only works when people believe it will never be challenged. Humanity's defining trait has never been perfect strength or flawless strategy. It has been the refusal to stay down once pressure appears. The ability to endure, adapt, and rise again has shaped every stage of human progress. That persistence makes humanity difficult to dominate. An empire may win a battle, but victory becomes temporary if the defeated continue searching for ways to resist. Systems built on fear struggle against populations that refuse to accept defeat as permanent. The empire believed they were confronting a civilization that would collapse under overwhelming force. What they were actually confronting was something far more resilient, a species that treats setbacks as temporary obstacles rather than final outcomes. And that difference alone was enough to ensure the empire had already miscalculated the situation. Everything begins in the mind. Long before any action is taken, long before resistance appears, long before courage becomes visible, the real battle has already started in the quiet space where decisions are formed. That invisible battlefield determines whether someone bends under pressure or stands firm against it. Most people never notice this moment because it happens so quickly. Pressure appears, fear rises, and the mind immediately searches for the safest path forward. It calculates risks, weighs consequences, and quietly guides the person toward whatever choice feels most secure. That instinct protects survival, but it also creates a dangerous habit. When safety becomes the only priority, surrender begins to look reasonable. Across societies, systems quietly train people to think this way. They reward obedience. They celebrate comfort. They encourage individuals to avoid conflict whenever possible. Over time, the mind adapts to that environment. It learns that staying quiet is easier than standing up. It learns that blending in is safer than challenging authority. Eventually, the idea of resistance starts to feel unnatural. People begin believing they need perfect conditions before they can act. They wait for the right moment, the right support, the right opportunity where the risks are small and the outcome feels predictable. But those conditions almost never arrive. The individuals who change the course of events rarely wait for safety. They operate with a different mindset entirely. Instead of asking whether success is guaranteed, they focus on something far more important. They ask whether surrender is acceptable. That single shift in thinking transforms everything. When surrender becomes unacceptable, the mind stops searching for comfortable solutions. It stops trying to protect the illusion of security. Instead, it begins looking for ways to act despite the danger. This is the mindset that has shaped the turning points of history. It does not rely on perfect preparation. It does not require overwhelming resources. It begins with a simple internal decision, refusing to let fear dictate every outcome. The empire believed humanity would respond according to the usual pattern. They expected hesitation, debate, and eventually compliance. They assumed that logic would guide human thinking toward survival at any cost. But that assumption misunderstood how powerful a shift in mindset can be. Human beings are capable of changing their perspective in an instant. One realization can alter how a situation is interpreted. One moment of clarity can replace fear with determination. Once that shift happens, the entire environment begins to look different. What once appeared impossible suddenly becomes worth attempting. Obstacles that seemed overwhelming start to look like challenges rather than barriers. The focus moves away from avoiding defeat and toward refusing submission. This change is subtle, but its impact can be enormous. The empire relied on fear to control behavior. Fear creates hesitation. It causes people to question themselves. It convinces them that resistance will only lead to greater loss. As long as fear dominates the mind, obedience follows naturally. But fear loses power the moment someone stops, allowing it to control their decisions. When the mindset changes, fear becomes information rather than authority. It remains present, but it no longer decides the outcome. The individual recognizes the risks, yet continues forward anyway. That is, the moment when intimidation stops working. The empire had faced countless opponents who calculated the odds and stepped aside. They expected humanity to follow the same path because that response had become predictable across the galaxy. What they did not expect was a species capable of shifting its mindset so quickly. Instead of accepting the logic of surrender, humanity responded with a different perspective entirely. The situation was no longer about winning against overwhelming power. It became about refusing to accept the role the Empire had assigned to them. That mental shift carried enormous consequences. Once surrender is rejected as an option, new possibilities appear. Creativity emerges. Determination strengthens. People begin thinking beyond the limits imposed by fear. The Empire believed their strength controlled the future. Humanity demonstrated that the future often begins with a single change in the way someone chooses to think. One of the hardest truths to accept is how often people wait. They wait for the right moment, the right support, the right circumstances that make action feel safe and justified. Waiting feels reasonable. It feels responsible. It allows time to think, to prepare, to avoid unnecessary risk. But waiting can also become a quiet form of surrender that hides behind the appearance of patience. Powerful systems understand this better than most people realize. They rarely rely on force alone. Force is expensive, unpredictable, and dangerous even for those who control it. Instead, they rely on hesitation. They rely on the natural human tendency to delay difficult decisions. If individuals wait long enough, pressure eventually settles into normalcy. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes tolerated simply because nothing changed. This is how control spreads without resistance. People convince themselves that someone else will act first. Leaders expect the population to move. The population waits for leaders to decide. Each side looks at the other, hoping someone will step forward. Meanwhile, the system remains untouched because hesitation freezes everyone in place. The Empire expected humanity to fall into this exact trap. They assumed fear would trigger endless debate. Governments would gather, analyze the threat, and argue over possible responses. Experts would calculate risks. Citizens would worry about survival. Days would pass, then weeks, then months, as the reality of the Empire's power slowly convinced everyone that resistance was impossible. In that environment, surrender would eventually feel inevitable. But there is another harsh truth that disrupts this pattern. Change almost never begins with perfect unity. It rarely starts with overwhelming support or universal agreement. More often, it begins with one person stepping forward before anyone else is ready. That moment breaks the cycle of waiting. When someone acts without permission, without consensus, without the guarantee of support, it forces everyone watching to reconsider their own hesitation. Suddenly, the question shifts from, "Is it possible?" to, "Why hasn't anyone else done this already?" The difference between those two questions can change everything. Waiting is comfortable because it avoids responsibility. If nothing happens, no one can be blamed for failure. Everyone remains safe within the crowd. But the cost of that comfort is enormous. Systems that depend on obedience continue growing stronger while individuals remain trapped in passive observation. This pattern repeats across history. Entire populations have watched injustice unfold while convincing themselves it was not their role to intervene. They assumed someone more powerful would solve the problem. They believed their individual actions would not matter. By the time they realized change required participation, the system had already become far more difficult to challenge. The Empire believed humanity would behave the same way. They trusted that fear would encourage delay. That delay would weaken confidence. That weakened confidence would eventually lead to surrender. But they overlooked something fundamental about human behavior. Sometimes the pressure becomes so intense that waiting no longer feels safe. Sometimes the consequences of inaction become just as frightening as the consequences of resistance. In those moments, individuals stop asking whether they are ready and start asking whether they can tolerate doing nothing. That question is dangerous for any system built on intimidation. Once someone decides that waiting is no longer acceptable, the entire structure of hesitation begins to collapse. Others begin noticing that action is possible. They realize that permission was never required in the first place. The Empire relied on fear to create silence. But silence does not always last forever. Eventually, someone recognizes the trap. They see how hesitation has been quietly shaping every decision. They understand that waiting has already allowed power to expand unchecked, and in that moment, the decision changes. Instead of asking when the right time will come, the individual realizes the right time may never appear, so action begins anyway. The empire demanded surrender because they believed humanity would hesitate long enough for fear to become permanent. What they failed to understand was that hesitation ends the moment someone decides waiting is no longer an option. Symbols have always carried more power than people expect. A single action, a single image, a single moment can reshape how an entire population understands its situation. When individuals witness something that contradicts the story they were told to believe, the effect spreads quietly through the mind. Doubt appears. Questions begin forming. Confidence in the system that once seemed untouchable starts to weaken. This is why powerful empires carefully manage perception. Control is not maintained by force alone. It is maintained by shaping what people believe is possible. When a population believes resistance is hopeless, control becomes effortless. Fear fills the empty spaces where courage might have grown. People begin repeating the same conclusion to themselves: nothing can change. Once that belief becomes widespread, the system becomes stable. The empire had mastered this strategy. Their reputation traveled faster than their fleets. Entire civilizations surrendered the moment they realized who was approaching their skies. They had learned that psychological dominance was far more efficient than constant warfare. If people believed resistance would fail, most would never attempt it. Over time, that reputation turned into myth. The empire became something larger than a political power. It became an idea that said opposition was pointless. An idea that convinced countless species that submission was the only logical response to survival. That idea was their greatest weapon. But ideas are fragile when confronted with a powerful counterexample. The moment someone breaks the pattern, the myth begins to crack. Humanity understood this in a way the empire never expected. The response that was sent was not simply a person carrying orders. It was a message designed to disrupt the empire's narrative. One individual standing as the answer to overwhelming force forced everyone watching to reconsider what they thought. They understood. It transformed the entire situation into a symbol. Symbols travel further than weapons ever could. They spread through thought, through conversation, through imagination. Once people witness something that contradicts fear, they begin to picture new possibilities. That is exactly what the empire feared most, not destruction. Not even rebellion. They feared the moment when their reputation stopped being absolute, because reputation is the invisible foundation of dominance. As long as the legend of invincibility remains intact, opposition collapses before it begins. But once that legend is challenged, uncertainty spreads rapidly. One person standing against the empire carried that challenge. It demonstrated something simple yet dangerous. The empire was powerful, but it was not beyond confrontation. The myth that resistance was impossible suddenly looked weaker. If one individual could represent defiance, perhaps others could as well. The power of that realization cannot be measured through numbers or fleets. It operates inside the mind. Once people begin imagining resistance, they start questioning other assumptions they once accepted without hesitation. Fear loses its certainty. Authority loses its aura of inevitability. The system that once appeared permanent begins to look vulnerable. This is how great shifts often begin. Not with massive battles or dramatic revolutions, but with a single moment that exposes the illusion of absolute control. When people realize the structure of power depends heavily on belief, they start understanding their own role in maintaining it. The empire believed their demand for surrender would reinforce their legend. They expected humanity's response to confirm the narrative they had built across the galaxy. Another civilization would bow, and the myth of their invincibility would grow even stronger. Instead, something entirely different happened. The response challenged the myth itself. One individual standing in defiance became a symbol that traveled far beyond the original moment. It forced every observer to reconsider the assumptions that had supported the Empire's dominance for so long. The Empire thought they were confronting a species that could be intimidated into obedience. What they actually encountered was a species capable of turning even a single human into a message powerful enough to shake the foundations of their legend. The real battle was never only about an empire and a civilization. It was never only about fleets, power, or the threat of destruction. The deeper conflict has always existed in a place far closer and far more personal than distant galaxies. It lives inside the human mind, in the quiet moments where decisions are made about whether to stand firm or quietly surrender. Every person faces that moment in different forms throughout life. Pressure appears in many shapes. Sometimes it looks like authority demanding obedience. Sometimes it looks like fear whispering that resistance will only make things worse. Sometimes it arrives as doubt, slowly convincing the mind that the safest choice is to step aside and accept whatever outcome has been decided by stronger forces. Those moments rarely feel dramatic. They rarely look like history unfolding in front of a crowd. Most of the time, they are quiet and private. A decision made in silence. A thought that passes through the mind and asks a simple question: continue forward or give up? That question appears more often than most people notice. It appears when obstacles feel too large. It appears when others insist something cannot be done. It appears when systems seem too powerful to challenge, and the easier path is to stop trying altogether. In those moments, the temptation to surrender can feel almost logical. After all, survival often favors caution. But history has always moved forward because certain individuals rejected that logic. They saw the same obstacles, the same pressure, the same overwhelming systems standing in their path. Yet something inside them refused to accept the idea that power automatically determines the future. They chose to stand anyway. That decision does not require perfection. It does not require extraordinary strength or flawless confidence. It begins with something much simpler: the refusal to allow fear, doubt, or pressure to become the final authority over one's choices. The Empire believed control was permanent because they assumed fear would always win this internal battle. They believed individuals would eventually decide that resistance was not worth the cost. That assumption had worked many times before, but it depended on one fragile condition. It depended on people believing they had no choice. The moment that belief disappears, the entire structure of control begins to weaken. Systems that rely on intimidation lose their strongest weapon. Authority built on fear begins to look less certain. What once seemed impossible begins to feel within reach. This is the quiet truth that has reshaped history again and again. Every major shift began when someone realized surrender was not the only option. That realization does not arrive with permission. It does not wait for approval from crowds or institutions. It begins the moment a person looks at overwhelming pressure and decides it will not define the outcome. That is the challenge hidden within this story. Look honestly at the places where pressure has already shaped decisions. Look at the moments where hesitation quietly replaced action. Consider how often fear, doubt, or the expectations of others influence choices that could have gone in a different direction. Those are the moments where the real conflict exists. Not between empires and civilizations, but between surrender and defiance inside the human mind. The lesson is not about becoming fearless or pretending obstacles do not exist. The lesson is recognizing that fear only controls the future when it is allowed to make the final decision. Every person eventually faces a moment where the easier path is to kneel, where surrender promises comfort, safety, or acceptance. Those moments test something deeper than strength. They test whether the individual is willing to stand alone if necessary. The Empire believed humanity would kneel because fear would guide every choice. But history continues to prove something that powerful systems never fully learn. Sometimes all it takes to change everything is one human who refuses to kneel.